It was just another normal day at the store until one small act of kindness turned everything upside down. A frail elderly woman, struggling to pay for her groceries, becomes the target of an impatient cashier's harsh words. As the situation escalates, it seems like no one will step in. The woman's hands tremble with embarrassment as she fumbles with her purse. But what happens next is something no one saw coming. Just when the tension reaches its peak, an unexpected figure steps in. Keanu Reeves, who, instead of turning a blind eye like most, decides to take action. But his gesture isn't just about paying for her groceries. It's a powerful reminder of something much more profound, something that will make you rethink how we treat others in moments of vulnerability. What happens when one celebrity challenges the world's cold indifference and teaches us all a lesson in humanity? The truth may surprise you. The supermarket was buzzing with the usual evening rush. People hurried down the aisles, their carts piled high with last-minute items as the registers beeped nonstop. The line at the checkout counter seemed endless, stretching back to the entrance, with shoppers eager to finish their purchases and leave. Among the customers, an elderly woman stood at the first register, her small cart filled with basic necessities: bread, milk, a few vegetables, and some canned goods. Her frail hands shook slightly as she tried to retrieve her wallet from her oversized handbag. She fumbled for a moment, her movements slow, and she didn't notice the impatient sigh coming from the young cashier standing behind the counter. The cashier, a young man with dark circles under his eyes, had already been working for hours. His face was taut, strained by the monotony of the day. His patience was wearing thin, and the growing line behind the elderly woman only added to his irritation. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares on him, waiting for the transaction to move forward. As the elderly woman took longer than expected to find her wallet, he let out a visible sigh, his irritation growing with each passing second. His shoulders stiffened as he impatiently tapped his fingers on the counter. He glanced at the clock, wishing for the end of his shift, his frustration mounting. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she finally found her wallet, but her nerves made it hard to open it quickly. She apologized softly, hoping the young man would understand that she was simply struggling with the task at hand. But instead of showing patience, the cashier snapped at her, his tone rising, making it clear he was fed up. His words were sharp and condescending, his body language tense. She flinched at his tone, taken aback by his sudden change in behavior. She had only hesitated for a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she attempted to pay, her hands shaking as she rifled through the bills and coins. The customers behind her shifted impatiently, some muttering to themselves while others impatiently checked their watches. The tension in the air was thick, and the woman could feel the eyes of everyone in the line on her. The cashier's harsh demeanor only made it worse. His irritation continued to seep through his words, and with each passing second, she felt more humiliated. It wasn't just the frustration in his voice. It was the way he spoke to her, as if she didn't belong in that space, as if she were an inconvenience. Her hands fumbled with the money as she tried to pay, but the shaking made it hard to grab the right amount. The world around her seemed to narrow, and the eyes of the other customers felt like a spotlight that burned through her skin. She apologized again, her voice barely above a whisper, but her words seemed to disappear in the angry air. The cashier's eyes didn't soften. Instead, they narrowed with disdain. His gaze flicked toward the growing line of customers waiting behind her. It was clear that he just wanted her out of the way. She was taking too long. She was a problem that needed to be fixed, and she could feel his judgment weighing on her like a heavy burden. Her heart raced, and she desperately wanted to make the transaction smooth and quick, but it was as if everything was moving in slow motion. Around her, the atmosphere felt charged. The other customers, who had been quietly going about their own purchases, were now completely aware of what was happening. Some glanced at her with subtle discomfort, others with disapproval, but no one spoke up. They all seemed content to let the scene unfold, too absorbed in their own impatience to intervene. The tension in the air only intensified and the woman felt small and insignificant. The weight of everyone's expectations, their impatience, was like a weight she couldn't shake off. She tried to speed up, but the more she rushed, the more mistakes she made, and the more the cashier grew frustrated. She could hear him sighing under his breath, the impatience in his movements as he scanned the next item. The line behind her grew longer, and she felt the anxious energy of the crowd pressing in on her. The cashier didn't even look at her anymore. He was too focused on getting the transaction over with. With each beep of the scanner, the woman became more aware of how she was failing to meet his expectations. She could feel the eyes of the people behind her like a force pushing her forward, forcing her to finish quickly, but every attempt to hurry only seemed to make things worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the elderly woman handed over the last of her change, her hand shaking so much that the coins rattled as they fell onto the counter. The cashier didn't even glance at her as he bagged her items. The woman didn't even have the courage to look him in the eye as she took her bags. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she gathered her things and turned to leave. The moment she walked away from the counter, the tension in the air seemed to lift, but the sting of the humiliation remained. She had done nothing wrong, but in that moment, she felt like she had failed. As she walked out of the store, she tried to hold her head high, but the weight of the encounter lingered, and it seemed like she was still under the harsh judgment of the cashier and the silent crowd. The scene at the register, though small in the grand scheme of things, had left a mark on the woman. She had been made to feel less than, as though she didn't deserve the space she was occupying in the store. She had become a target for frustration, and in the eyes of the cashier and the people around her, she had been nothing more than an obstacle to their day. It wasn't just the unkind words or the impatience. It was the feeling of being invisible, of being ignored and dismissed, that made the moment so painful. She had walked into the store as a person, but by the time she left, she felt like nothing more than a shadow in the background of a busy world that had no room for her. The elderly woman continued to struggle, her hands shaking as she tried to pull out the correct amount of change. Her movements had slowed even more, and it was clear that the pressure of the situation was overwhelming her. The cashier, growing more impatient by the second, continued to show his frustration, tapping his fingers on the counter and casting quick, irritated glances toward the growing line behind her. Each second felt like an eternity, and the woman, despite her best efforts, was unable to speed up her motions. The cold, mechanical rhythm of the transaction seemed to mock her every attempt. She felt the weight of the cashier's gaze on her, and with each passing moment, she became more and more aware of how out of place she felt in this bustling world. As the tension escalated, the rest of the customers in line began to shift their weight from foot to foot, some growing visibly uncomfortable, others subtly shaking their heads in silent judgment. The noise of the store seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the heightened sense of discomfort hanging in the air. The woman was now fully aware that she had become the center of attention, though not in the way she had hoped. She wasn't simply a customer trying to buy groceries. She was now an inconvenience, an obstacle for everyone around her. But then, in the middle of this escalating moment, something shifted. One of the customers in line, standing just behind the elderly woman, noticed the scene unfolding. A slight murmur rippled through the crowd as they too noticed him, the figure in the queue standing silently behind her. It was Keanu Reeves, who had been waiting in line like everyone else, but now his gaze was fixed on the situation in front of him. His face, usually calm and composed, reflected a quiet but unmistakable concern. Unlike the others around him, who were too absorbed in their impatience to intervene, Keanu could no longer ignore what was happening. His expression softened, and without hesitation, he made his decision. He stepped forward, moving with purpose but without drawing attention to himself. His actions were smooth, deliberate, and filled with quiet determination. As he reached the elderly woman, he didn't say anything. He simply moved to her side and placed his hand gently on the handle of her shopping cart. The touch was light, but it conveyed everything he needed to say. It was a subtle yet powerful gesture of support, a silent declaration that she wasn't alone in this moment. The effect was immediate. The cashier, who had been focused entirely on the woman, was momentarily taken aback by the sudden presence of Keanu. His hands froze mid-motion, and for a brief second, the annoyance on his face was replaced by confusion. He looked up, meeting Keanu's gaze, and there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Keanu's eyes were calm, steady, and unwavering, but there was no aggression in them, only a quiet strength that stood in stark contrast to the tension in the air. It was clear to the cashier that this was not a moment to escalate things further. Keanu didn't need to say a word. His calm, confident presence spoke for him. The quiet authority of his gaze was enough to bring a halt to the rising conflict. For a brief, charged moment, the world seemed to stop. The eyes of the other customers, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort, were now all turned toward Keanu. The cashier, still a bit stunned by the unexpected intervention, hesitated. He stood there for a moment, processing the shift that had just taken place, unsure of how to respond. Keanu's hand on the cart was a silent command that conveyed everything necessary. This wasn't just a matter of patience. It was about treating others with dignity and respect. The woman, who had been shrinking under the weight of the situation, now found herself in the unexpected comfort of Keanu's steady presence. The simple act of him standing there, offering his support, was enough to change the entire dynamic. She slowly began to regain her composure, the tension in her body easing as she realized she was no longer facing the situation alone. The cashier, still processing what had just happened, took a small step back. He wasn't sure what to do, his internal conflict growing as he realized the power imbalance had shifted. The confidence in Keanu's presence wasn't demanding. It wasn't about controlling the situation. It was simply about being there for someone when they needed it most. Keanu didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. His quiet intervention spoke volumes. The moment stretched on, the silence in the air heavy with unspoken words. Keanu remained steady, his presence like an anchor in a sea of rising tension. The other customers, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, seemed to breathe easier now that the situation had calmed. The elderly woman, still uncertain but now feeling the support of Keanu's presence, took a deep breath and slowly started to finish the transaction. The cashier, still visibly unsettled by what had just transpired, scanned the next item with a lack of enthusiasm. But something had shifted inside him. He realized that he was no longer in control of the situation, and in that realization, there was a quiet understanding that maybe he hadn't been handling it the right way from the beginning. For a moment, the scene seemed frozen in time. The tension that had been so palpable just moments ago had dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm that lingered in the air. The elderly woman, though still feeling the effects of the earlier discomfort, now stood with her head a little higher, the weight of the confrontation lifting from her shoulders. Keanu, standing quietly beside her, gave her a small nod of reassurance, his simple presence serving as a reminder that kindness can change everything, even in the most ordinary of places. In that brief interaction, Keanu had not only diffused the tension, but also reminded everyone present that the smallest gestures of empathy and understanding can make all the difference in the world. The cashier, though still processing the events, had learned something about the power of quiet support, and the rest of the audience, now more aware of the dynamics around them, had been reminded of the importance of standing up for what's right, even in the smallest of moments. Keanu gently reached for the elderly woman's wallet, his movements slow and deliberate, exuding a sense of sincerity that immediately put her at ease. There was no rush, no impatience in his demeanor, just a quiet understanding that what was unfolding was more than just a simple transaction. To him, it was an act of compassion, something so instinctive that it didn't need to be explained or justified. As he held the wallet, his touch was reassuring, almost tender, as though he were not just paying for groceries, but extending an unspoken offer of dignity to someone who had been robbed of it. There was nothing dramatic in the gesture, no fanfare, just a calm presence that spoke volumes in the silence of the store. The cashier, still standing behind the counter, watched in stunned silence. His earlier aggression had been completely dissolved by Keanu's presence. But it wasn't just the act of paying for the groceries that had an effect on him. It was the way Keanu carried himself, the quiet, unassuming way he moved through the world. Keanu didn't demand attention or applause for his actions. There was no self-righteousness, no superiority in his stance. He simply did what felt right, and in doing so, he shifted the energy in the room entirely. The atmosphere, which had been thick with discomfort and impatience just moments earlier, now felt lighter, calmer, as though the world itself had taken a deep breath. Keanu didn't need to make a spectacle of the moment. He didn't raise his voice or make grand statements. His calmness was its own form of protest against the aggression the elderly woman had faced. He placed the money for her groceries on the counter and quietly handed over the receipt. Without waiting for a word of thanks or recognition, he turned back to the cashier. The young man behind the counter, still frozen in place, stared at him, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew that something had shifted. The power dynamic had been completely altered, and for the first time in the exchange, he felt small. Keanu's gaze met his, but there was no anger, no reprimand. There was simply an invitation to understand. Keanu didn't speak loudly, but his words carried weight. He wasn't interested in confronting the cashier or making him feel ashamed. Instead, he spoke with a quiet authority that wasn't about power, but about humanity. His words were measured, calm, and full of a deep, intrinsic understanding of what it meant to treat others with respect. He reminded the young man, without judgment, of the importance of patience and empathy. Keanu spoke not only of the elderly woman's situation, but also of the broader human experience. How often we forget that people move at different paces, and that it's our duty to meet them with kindness, not impatience. The cashier, still processing the shift in the room, stood there, his mind racing. Keanu's words weren't harsh. They were simply reminders of what should be obvious: that people, no matter their age, their status, or their speed, deserve to be treated with dignity. Keanu wasn't there to scold him, to shame him into understanding. He was simply showing the way. He spoke of how no one should ever be reduced to a nuisance or a burden. He spoke of the beauty of slowing down and recognizing the humanity in others, even when they seemed to be slowing you down. It was a message, simple and straightforward, but it resonated in the air, hanging there like a challenge. The cashier's initial shock began to give way to something else, something that, if he allowed it, could lead to a shift in his perspective. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. The silence that followed spoke volumes. In that moment, the cashier understood something he hadn't before. He realized that his earlier actions, his harsh treatment of the elderly woman, had been wrong. Not because Keanu had called him out directly, but because Keanu had quietly reminded him of something more important than rules, efficiency, or speed: the fundamental value of human kindness. Keanu's calm, composed nature stood in stark contrast to the previous aggression, and the effect was palpable. The store, which had been filled with the low hum of impatience, now felt different. The other customers, who had been watching the scene unfold, were also impacted by the subtle yet powerful exchange. The energy in the room shifted from frustration to reflection. They weren't just watching an actor being kind. They were witnessing a human being offering something more profound, a reminder that we all have the capacity for kindness, especially in moments of difficulty. Keanu didn't expect the cashier to change instantly. There were no dramatic apologies, no immediate epiphanies. But in his eyes, the young man began to soften. His previously rigid posture relaxed, and for the first time, he looked at the elderly woman, not as an inconvenience, but as a person. He looked at her with the kind of understanding that hadn't existed before. Keanu's intervention hadn't been a reprimand, but a lesson, one that didn't need to be spoken loudly to be heard. It was the kind of lesson that stayed with you long after the moment had passed. The elderly woman, though still shaken by the earlier experience, felt a sense of relief. She had been treated as though she didn't belong, but now Thanks to Keanu's quiet yet powerful presence, she felt seen, heard, and valued. She had been given the dignity she deserved, not through words, but through the simple act of kindness that Keanu had shown her. As she gathered her things and began to leave, her steps felt a little lighter, her heart a little fuller. She knew that she would carry this moment with her. Not just the act of the man paying for her groceries, but the way he had stood up for her, and for the simple decency that we too often overlook. Keanu turned, his presence still calm and steady, and without any expectation of acknowledgement, began to walk away. He didn't linger, didn't make a spectacle of his actions. There was no need. The change had already occurred. It wasn't in the form of grand gestures or applause. It was in the quiet transformation of the space around him, in the softening of the cashier's gaze, and in the realization that sometimes the most powerful moments of change come not from confrontation, but from a reminder of what it means to be human. After Keanu had paid for the elderly woman's groceries, he gently guided her toward the exit of the store. The woman, who had been so visibly shaken and embarrassed moments earlier, now walked with a softer expression on her face, a faint smile beginning to form. Her eyes glistened with gratitude, and there was a noticeable weight lifted from her shoulders. The air between them was calm and filled with unspoken understanding. As they walked through the aisles toward the door, her pace seemed a little steadier, her body language less burdened. She had not only been relieved of her immediate discomfort, but she had also been reminded of her inherent dignity, something she had almost lost in the harshness of the earlier exchange. Meanwhile, the customers in the line had begun to process what had just happened. At first, they had been distracted, impatient with their own waiting times and concerned about their own purchases. But now, as they watched Keanu walk out with the elderly woman, they were starting to realize something. The shift in the energy of the store, from tension and discomfort to calm and respect, hadn't come from any grand gestures or dramatic words. It had come from one simple act of kindness, one person stepping up to show that empathy could, indeed, change the course of a moment. Some of the customers exchanged quick, knowing glances, their faces softening as they reflected on what they had just witnessed. They had been part of this small story, part of a simple, quiet transformation. A few people stood taller, perhaps unknowingly inspired by the example set in front of them. It was a fleeting moment, but the ripple of change was evident. It was clear to them that, in just a few minutes, an ordinary interaction had turned into something extraordinary. They were no longer just shoppers in a busy store. They had been part of something deeper, something that had touched on shared humanity. The cashier, still standing at the counter, mechanically scanned the next item. But his movements were slower now, almost detached, as if his mind was still occupied with what had just occurred. He processed the groceries mechanically, his hands moving almost on autopilot, but his mind was elsewhere. The hard, sharp edge that had once defined his expression had softened. The tightness in his jaw was no longer as pronounced, and his gaze, which had been filled with frustration and impatience earlier, was now more subdued. He wasn't fully present in the moment. His thoughts seemed to be running in a quiet loop, replaying the brief exchange with Keanu. He glanced up the now empty line, and for the first time, he noticed the lingering silence in the air. The store, which had once felt like a buzzing, restless place, now seemed quieter. The usual buzz of impatient customers had been replaced by an unspoken shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle but palpable, a sense of calm and reflection that hadn't been there before. The energy in the store had changed, and the cashier, still standing there, felt it too. He looked down at the counter, his mind returning to the words Keanu had said, even though he had barely spoken. It wasn't the words themselves that had impacted him so much as the way they were delivered, calmly, thoughtfully, and without any trace of judgment. Keanu hadn't accused him of anything. He hadn't lashed out or tried to make him feel small. Instead, he had spoken from a place of quiet understanding, reminding the cashier of something he hadn't thought about in a long time. That people aren't machines, and sometimes patience and kindness are more important than efficiency or speed. The cashier stood there, processing the next item, but his mind was now occupied with the thoughts of the woman he had treated so harshly. He began to wonder if she had left the store feeling humiliated, if she had felt like an inconvenience, just another obstacle in the way of a perfect transaction. He thought about how he had rushed her, how he had made her feel small and insignificant for being slower than others. He hadn't meant to make her feel that way, but now, in the quiet aftermath of Keanu's intervention, he saw it clearly. He had treated her with impatience when what she needed was understanding. He had forgotten the most important thing: kindness, the very thing that made people human. As Keanu and the elderly woman exited the store, the cashier stood motionless, the store around him seeming to fade into the background. His gaze remained distant, his mind still turning over the events that had just unfolded. He realized that he had been too quick to judge, too wrapped up in the urgency of the moment to see the person in front of him. He realized that he could have handled the situation with more grace, more understanding, and more patience. But now, with the weight of reflection pressing on him, he understood. He hadn't just been unfair to the woman. He had been unfair to himself, to the very essence of human connection. The moment felt like an epiphany, and though he didn't speak a word, the realization was there, clear as day. He wasn't angry at Keanu or the woman. He wasn't even angry at himself. Instead, he was quietly ashamed of how quickly he had lost sight of what was truly important in his day-to-day interactions. He hadn't just made a mistake with the woman. He had allowed the stresses of his job to cloud his ability to see the person in front of him, and that's what needed to change. Keanu and the elderly woman disappeared into the parking lot, and the atmosphere in the store remained a quiet reminder of what kindness could do. The cashier, still holding the scanner, looked up as a new customer approached. But this time, his expression was different. He didn't rush. He took a moment to look at the person standing in front of him. He was more patient now, more aware of the importance of each interaction, of each person who came through his line. His thoughts weren't just on the task at hand anymore. They were on the humanity of the people in front of him. It was a small change, but it was profound. As the store continued its usual rhythm, there was a new undercurrent running through the space, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest moments could lead to a deep reflection and change. The cashier didn't yet know exactly how he would change in the future, but he knew this. The lesson from Keanu would stay with him. And though it had come from an unexpected place, it had reminded him of the power of compassion, patience, and, most of all, humanity. He wasn't just a cashier anymore. He was a person, and so was everyone else. And that, he realized, made all the difference.